So, all right, well, I'm going to get started. My name is Kerry Cranston. For those of you who don't know me, I want to welcome you to the American Writers Museum Online. I know we have a lot of folks on here tonight who may not be from the Chicago area. So if you have not been to the American Writers Museum before, I encourage you to visit us online at theamericanwritersmuseum.org. You can also check out some of our previous programming on our YouTube channel at youtube.com/American Writers Museum. We have programming regularly, most every week, and we hope if you really enjoy what you see here tonight that you consider becoming a member or supporter through our website, and that you at least follow us and check out some of our future programming coming up in the weeks and months ahead. But tonight, I know you're all here to hear from our author guest and to enjoy the program, and so I'm going to jump right ahead to that. We have a special guest tonight with our author, Scott Turow, for a fun conversation, especially for all the lawyers who I know are in attendance tonight. But before we get to our two guests, I just want to point out two quick things. One, if you have not bought Scott's book yet, please feel free to click the link in the chat window to buy a copy from our book-selling partner, Seminary Co-op, a local nonprofit bookstore here in Chicago, and they will gladly ship one right out to you, and the link will take you straight to the book. Also, after the initial conversation between our guest writer and moderator, we'll open this up to the audience for questions. We'll be reading the questions that people submit. So if you have a question you want to ask tonight, make sure and click the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen and type in your question. We'll be going through those and we'll get to as many of them as we can tonight. So again, we've got a pretty big audience. So that being said, I want to just kind of jump into talking about our guests. I want to first introduce our moderator for the evening, Olivia Betty, an experienced trial lawyer. Olivia has litigated and tried significant cases before the U.S. District Court for the Northern District of Illinois and other federal courts around the country. Has also briefed and argued patent appeals before the Federal Circuit. Her industry diverse practice includes the fields of biochemistry, chemistry, computer engineering, electrical engineering, metallurgy, nanotechnology, and mechanical engineering, among others. On top of this, Olivia is a board member of the American Writers Museum and a big fan of our guest author, Scott Turow. Now, Scott Turow is both an attorney and the author of numerous best-selling works of fiction, including Testimony, Identical, Innocent, Presumed Innocent, The Burden of Proof, and too many to list them all, as well as two nonfiction books, including 1L, about his experience as a law student. His books have been translated into more than 40 languages, sold more than 30 million copies worldwide, and have been adapted into movies and television projects. He's frequently contributed essays and op-ed pieces to publications such as the New York Times, the Washington Post, Vanity Fair, the New Yorker, and the Atlantic. So while I wish you could all let out a large round of applause for our guests that they could hear, I'll just say, please join me in welcoming Olivia and Scott.
Thanks, Kerry. Hi, Scott. I'm so thrilled to be here with you to chat about the last trial.
Well, thank you for doing this, Olivia, and thanks to Kerry for the forum and the nice introduction.
Well, I'm really, really sorry to not be sitting next to you at the museum because of what's going on. But because of what's going on, we're able to welcome so many non-local friends here to the museum tonight. We have, I think, close to 500 people here. And due to the fire code, there's no way we would fit more than 200 normally. So welcome, everyone. Scott, this is your 12th crime thriller set in Kendall County. So, which as a Chicagoan reading it, it's pretty clear that Kendall County is based on Cook County. And I learned that years ago, actually watching Presumed Innocent with Harrison Ford in the elevated tracks. Right? After you graduated from Harvard Law School, you spent 8 years as an AUSA here at the Northern District, so our federal court. For Kendall County and the courtroom scenes, do you weave in characteristics from other cities you visited or practiced in, or do you just like make changes to Chicago to make Kendall?
I think I probably flavor Chicago with the other cities where, I've been in the God knows how many years practicing law since 1978. So, I've been lucky because most of my practice has been in Chicago. But, I've been in a lot of other courtrooms over all that time, and was it 42 years? So occasionally I'll, for example, if you ask me where Judge Klonsky's magnificent courtroom came from, it's really borrowed from it's really borrowed from the library, and actually the Chicago Cultural Center and it's got more than a little bit of Cleveland in it as well. So.
Okay, that's fascinating because it doesn't sound like the Dirksen building, but there are flavors of just the courtroom scenes. And I know you've tried so many cases there that you can't help but model some of that after the Dirksen building. But why? So Sandy Stern is our main character in the last trial. What is it about Sandy, out of all the lawyers you've written about, that made you choose to include him in every single one of your books?
It's a great question. And, the truth is it has no exact answer, except that obviously all of the novels I've published have centered on the law. And Sandy Stern is, all things considered, the best lawyer of all of them. And so he's sort of the first citizen of Kendall County. He's not the mayor, he's not a TV talking head or a celebrity, but in that world, he's the sort of the central personality. And it would be hard to be practicing law, especially criminal law, in Kendall County without making some reference to Sandy Stern, even in passing. And so that's the way it's gone down in all of these books.
So I had a law partner who passed right after we tried 2 patent infringement juries at the Northern District. And I doubt he thought those were his last trials. He was in his early 70s. How did you come up with the idea of making this, the last trial for Sandy and having him age, from the other books?
Well, I really backed into this book, Olivia, in the sense that in Innocent, which was the sequel to Presumed Innocent, which was the last time Sandy made a major appearance in one of these books, he had, mostly because I was aware of his mortality, he had developed stage 4 non-small cell lung cancer, and he had an advanced disease. And he tried the case. There was a huge strawberry mark on his face, which was a side effect from one of the chemotherapies. He'd lost, 75 pounds. His suits hung on him like shrouds. And people who followed my work began writing to me and saying, please say Sandy Stern isn't going to die. And I sort of instinctively responded, well, he's not going to die yet. But when I wrote testimony and Stern shows up in one paragraph as a guest at a barbecue, I began to say to myself, how is it that this guy's lived so long with such a serious disease? And I said, well, maybe he's had some, experimental or new therapy that's, been life-saving in his case. And that is really how I started thinking about, G-Livia, as I call this drug, in the last trial, which is the wonder drug that's both saved Stern's life and led its developer, Dr. Kirill Pafko, to Judge Klonsky's courtroom, where he stands on trial, indicted for a variety of offenses, including RICO murder. So why I thought about Stern on trial, I mean, it would hardly be a book about Stern if he wasn't on trial.
So you mentioned G-Livia. So I actually am doing a lot of patent work for a client, like cancer treatments, and the research you must have put in for this book is probably astounding. What did you do to prepare for all of those scenes and the background research, and it's not just the technology you had to write about. You had to write about the marketing and everything else about drug development. And who helped you?
First of all, I had a lot of help along the way from my daughter, who's a pharmaceutical industry lawyer, and she was happy to correct my technical mistakes. So that was definitely a leg up. but I think all the time about the late Robert Parker. And we were on a panel together at the Art Institute. And somebody asked Parker how he managed to make all of his books, so realistic and all the technical information correct. And Parker smiled and said, "Oh, I'm just a good typist." And what he meant is that he is a little bit like an actor, an illusionist, and all novelists are. And to some extent, I'm like the young person who gets asked to teach high school math and just stays a day ahead of the students in the textbook. So I learned as much as I had to learn. I learned a little bit, and then I figured out what the plot would be, and then I learned more. But I thought it was the most complex body of law that I had ever dealt with in the 40 plus years of practicing law. And as I like to say, it makes the Internal Revenue Code look like a nursery rhyme. So anyway, I learned what I needed to learn. And occasionally I took a deep dive when it was relevant.
I'm impressed your daughter went to law school. Did she read 1L first? I mean, that she went after reading that?
I'm sure Rachel had read 1L before she went to law school. I don't recall talking with her about it. So, but she's my oldest child, and she's read everything that I've written. I remember in Stern's first appearance as the centerpiece of a novel in The Burden of Proof. She was 10 years old at that time, and I remember her paging through the manuscript, reading while we were driving somewhere. So I don't know how much of it she got as a 10-year-old, but I'm sure she read 1L as a result.
Well, I think it's a huge compliment and a testament to you being a great dad that she followed in your footsteps and went to law school. So Jonathan and I have 2 kids, and if one or both of them decide to be lawyers, we would love that. I think that'd be great.
I'm not sure her kids stand much of a chance because she married another lawyer. So there's going to be a lot of law in that household.
Well, I actually just read 1L for the first time, and even 19 years later, it was relevant. It brought back so many great memories. It brought me some PTSD. I mean, it was so well written. Did the classmates at Harvard Law School, did they know you were writing 1L when you were there? And for those of you in the audience, in case you're not a super fan and you didn't know, but I think most of you guys do know this, Scott taught writing at Stanford before he went to Harvard, and he actually had the contract for 1L ready to go when he went there. So he knew he was writing the book, but did your classmates know? Did your study group know?
My study group knew eventually. Eventually I realized who my closest friends were and who would be in somewhat transformed fashion, but who would be the central figures. And so they all knew. They all thought it was very, very cool until they read the book, which I let all of them do before publication. Then certainly one of them got fairly upset, and it was. I've learned this subsequently when people say, "Oh, I really want you to write about me." What they mean is, I want you to write about me very, very favorably. I want to look great. I want to be a giant.
Got it. And I mean, you did mention a Sandy Stern in 1L, but I understand that this is not the same Sandy Stern.
It is not the same Sandy Stern. When I sent in the manuscript for Presumed Innocent and was bought at Farrar, Straus and Giroux by the then young editor, now recently retired publisher at Farrar, Straus and Giroux, Jonathan Galassi, Jonathan went back and read 1L. And he calls me up, he says, there's a guy named Sandy Stern in this book too. And I was like, oh no, am I going to have to change this name? I just, something about the name Sandy Stern that I thought was perfect, was the efforts at being, American, that was embodied in being Sandy, and Stern, of course, with all the different meanings of the word. And I said, oh, I don't want to have to change this name. He said, don't change the name. He said, it'll be like a little parlor game for your readers. Is this the same Sandy Stern? So I didn't change it at Jonathan's advice, but no, they are not one and the same.
Is it hard to come up with new names? I guess because Sandy Stern was one that you liked and like stuck in your head. So every time you come up with a new book, there's all these new names you have to come up with. Do you have relatives helping you with ideas, or do you just pull them out of?
No, I did get a note from George Will, who was a reader of my books, and as soon as it came out, and he said, Kirill Pafko, huh? Pafko. He said, this is a nod to the Cub fans, I take it. And of course it is. Andy Pafko was a famous outfielder for the Cubs. And so sometimes, if I could, if it wouldn't become too much of a game and a joke, I would name every character for baseball players, because they're the most wonderful names in baseball. People with first names like Yonder, and they're great names. But there's certainly baseball contributes. I've never believed in that old canard that you should just pick up the phone book and decide just to name at random, and well, okay, so she'll be Carol Channing. It's I don't. There has to be something visceral about a name, at least to me. So.
Well, speaking of names, Pinky.
Yeah.
Can we talk about how you came up with that name, and then we'll talk about Pinky some.
Well, everybody who read the early drafts objected to the name Pinky, but I was very much in mind of something that somebody said to me, this was a former school teacher who said the one thing that she had learned in the classroom was odd kids usually had odd names, and so Pinky, who is actually named Clarice at birth, was called, Pinky by her great-grandmother, who was simply too old to remember her name, and just referred to her as Pinky because she was a rosy child. And the name ended up sticking. And I thought, just in the way that we're talking about, the oddity of that name was perfect for the character.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I had nothing in common with her, but she quickly became my favorite over all of her actions and how much she loved her grandfather. Well, is Pinky actually based on someone or one of
No, every now and then, I always say when a novel is going well, when a character who you never envisioned to start sort of picks up and runs away with the book. And Stern himself was that character. I worked on Presumed Innocent for years on the morning commuter train and never got to the trial. I didn't even know who was going to be accused of the murder. And all of a sudden, Rusty Savage, the prosecutor, is accused of murdering his former lover. And now he needs a defense lawyer, 190 pages into the book, and or 120. And that was where Stern came from. And as I say, he kind of ran away with the book. Somebody wrote me a note recently. Oh, one of my publishers, Larry Kirschbaum, said that he reread Presumed Innocent and he decided that it was really basically Sandy's book, which I think may go too far. But he definitely ran away with the book, just as Pinky sort of, forces herself in the forefront in this book.
Well, I mean, what is your issue with tattoos and nose nails? Do any
Uh,
kids
I-
have these ornaments? And
well, I have no issues with it. I would think that somebody with an 85-year-old grandfather, though, would find these things um, extremely odd. I mean, Pinky has got a 1-inch common nail driven through her nose, and she's tattooed everywhere that the casual onlooker can see. And I guess I'm growing accustomed to this, Olivia. I am somewhat happy about the fact that none of my kids have tattoos, at least that I know about. And but I found myself, and I am writing about Pinky now in a new book. And she explains to somebody, she says, you get born with your skin, and you're kind of stuck with it. But if you can change it, and that to her is the great appeal of a tattoo. So that's not in the last trial, and but I'm sure that will remain in whatever I call this forthcoming book, assuming I finish it.
I mean, I was just about to ask you that, like, you could write a whole series on her as an investigator because she's just so interesting.
Yeah,
So I'm thrilled to hear you're doing it.
I am, and I'm growing more confident. Obviously, when you're writing about somebody who's several decades younger than you are, you are naturally apprehensive about whether you're going to get it right. And I am still proceeding carefully, but I'm pretty convinced I can do it.
Will her book also have courtroom scenes, or will it be more outside of the courtroom if her character is more of an investigator than an attorney?
No, there will be quite a bit of testimony in this book. So,
Okay. Well, I look forward to it. My husband, Jonathan, is a criminal defense attorney like Sandy. And by the way, I think he's the most brilliant defense attorney like Sandy. We met in law school. We studied for the bar together. And needless to say, like, we understand each other's days and we use each other to develop strategies. He does openings and closings on me. Your wife, Adrienne, is also an attorney. And has her legal experience helped you with your recent books?
well, Aid, I met Adrienne when I interviewed her, as she was then a law student at Northwestern, and I was on the hiring committee at Sonnenschein, as it was then called. And I recommended hiring her, and I thought she had a brilliant future as a lawyer. But I took it for granted that she was going to be a litigator, and she was just, she's a somewhat forceful personality, not unpleasantly so, obviously. But anyway, she ended up becoming an estate planner, which she gave up when her first child was born. But there are times when her legal education really serves her well, and she always looks at me, she says, I would have been a great cross-examiner, wouldn't I? So, and she certainly can, hold on to a point. So,
Well, do you bounce ideas off of her for your books, or do you wait until you have a complete first draft before she does a first read? Because I know you put her in the acknowledgments as one of your first readers.
yeah, no, I've been talking to her a little bit about the book that I'm writing now. I want her perspective on it, and she's already weighed in a way that I think was helpful and important.
Did she help with any of your perspectives with the interactions with Donatella? Is Donatella modeled after some of our ladies who lunch at East Bank or U Club or anything like that?
Well, Donatella is the wife of Kirill Pafko, and Pafko is this world-renowned scientist, and Donatella is very much a woman of her generation. Also in her late 70s, and I think of her as brilliant, but one of those women in that era who assumed that she would have to live, her achievements would come through her husband's achievements, and that was just the basic deal that she made. But she's quite a formidable presence in her own right, and obviously I've known a lot of ladies like Donatella.
So here's a funny story. When I learned that we were going to have this chat, I spoke with the chief judge of the Northern District of Illinois, Judge Rebecca Pallmeyer, and she was really excited. She said a friend of hers was already reading the last trial and that there was a female chief judge in it, and was she anything like her? I started reading the last trial and realized right off, nope, this female judge is nothing like Judge Pallmeyer. And I later learned that, Judge Sonia Klonsky, or Sunny, has been in many of your books and was the main character in Laws of Our Fathers. But did you decide to make Sunny the chief judge before or after Judge Pallmeyer assumed the role as the first female chief judge of the Northern District in all of its 200 years in existence?
Well, I've known Judge Pallmeyer for many, many years, including having sat on the Judicial Selection Commission that recommended her to Senators Durbin and Mosley Braun. So I go back a long way, and our kids were peers in high school. They were in the same high school class. But despite my great admiration for her, I have to say that Sunny being the chief judge was almost a matter of mathematics. And I do keep track about what I have said about these characters. So Sunny years ago was a state court judge. And in one of the novels, in passing, it said that she moved on to the federal bench, which usually is regarded as a promotion, if for no other reason than you get life tenure when you become a federal judge. So she had to be, somewhere near 70. And I just said, logically, she's, a really experienced judge, and it would be a little more fun and a little more interesting if she were the chief and really the person who essentially, in a courthouse, is the central character in the operation of that courthouse. She's the highest ranking official in that courthouse, and a lot of administrative stuff goes through the chief judge. So, I wanted her too to be not just a powerful person, but somebody who was accustomed to being powerful, and like all the rest of us, she's not perfect. She's, as happens to judges over the years, she's become a little short-tempered on the bench, and quickly exasperated by lawyers because they've seen every trick 100 times. But I love Sunny Klonsky. She's another of my favorite characters, and I think she does a good job with this trial.
She did. She really did. Well, I think a lot of people on this Zoom call, including myself, work full time, and we feel like, especially with the quarantine, there's just so much going on. It's hard to keep up. Somehow you managed to do 2 full-time jobs, which is your partner, Denton's, which is a global law firm, and you write all of these books. Like, how in the world do you do it all? And when do you do your best writing?
Well, the secret, of course, is that I have practiced law only part-time since 1990. And part-time has meant less and less legal work as the years have gone on. After Presumed Innocent, I asked my partner's acquiescence to begin spending a significant part of my time on pro bono work. And there was a period of time when I was supposedly part-time, but I was really working full-time because I had both, the regular paying clients and very significant commitment to pro bono cases. But and I probably will continue to do some pro bono work, but I think my days practicing on paying cases are probably coming to a close shortly. So, but you know, I've enjoyed to whatever extent I've been able to mix the two callings. I've really enjoyed it. You have to. I always say that the thing that's allowed me to do it is that I'm not like not most writers, but some writers who have to be in a cork-lined room because they can't stand to be disturbed. And the biggest talent I've brought to doing both things has been that you know, a client can call me while I'm at home writing, and you learn which clients you can trust with your home phone number. Of course, these days everybody's got your cell, but and I can talk to the client about a complex issue, put the phone down, and go back to the sentence that I was writing without a hitch. And a lot of writers can't put up with those kinds of interruptions. They leave their own flow state and they can't get back into it. So that's one of the reasons I've been able to combine the two careers.
So I personally think that the courtroom scenes would be the hardest scenes to write out of your book. Do you find that to be true, or do you think that those are the easier ones for you to write? And by the way, I really, really appreciate those scenes as a trial lawyer, that you really stick to the law and you don't just like kind of dramatize it or throw things around all loose like they do on TV.
I have to admit, for you know, everybody who has been a prosecutor has the rules of evidence like burned onto their heart. And so for me to write the courtroom scenes was pretty automatic. And obviously I rewrote them and, you know, sharpened them. But the mechanics of it is really, after all of these years, pretty much second nature to me. So, you know, and the rules of evidence. And I never have, I think being in court, and I don't know how you feel about this, Olivia, but I think it's inherently dramatic. No matter what the case is, you're engaged in this confrontation between two people, whether it's the government and a criminal defendant or even a civil case, two people who are in deep conflict with one another. And that's being worked out through the law and through the lawyers. And there's this confrontation called cross-examination. It's dramatic. And people walk into courtrooms and can't make themselves leave. So I've never understood why you need to break the rules. And
yeah. I love it. It's thrilling. That's interesting. You bring up cross-examination. So kind of a preview to the Q&A that's coming up soon. I did have a chance to speak to one of your former AUSA buddies, Judge Thomas Durkin. He submitted a question for us. He wanted to know what your hardest cross-examination was that you've done.
As a prosecutor myself or as a defense lawyer?
He didn't specify, but is there one that sticks in your mind? There must be one that just...
Well, you know, it's oddly topical, but I tried a police beating case involving one of the West Suburban police departments. And they're very tough cases for people who have been watching current events in the United States. It's just very, very hard to convict a cop of using excessive force. But I indicted one of these cases, and I thought I had the case nailed down, and you know, then the cops came in, and when they were scared for their own well-being, they had told one story in the grand jury, and then they sat on the witness stand, and you know, cops are very bright, certainly very familiar with what's going on, and they altered their testimony so that they were almost like finding the loopholes in what had been said in the grand jury. And I remember those as particularly difficult crosses just because even when the guy had flipped me, and even when he was contradicting his grand jury testimony, I could tell that the jurors didn't care. And they didn't want to convict a cop for doing his job.
Sounds really, really difficult, and thank you for sharing that with us. I do want to move on to some of the Q&A because I see that we have a lot of questions here, and I want to get through as many of them as we can, if you don't mind. Here's one from Thomas McFeely. What made you decide to focus this particular novel around two older men? And by the way, the closing argument was one of the best courtroom scenes I've ever read. I've read it multiple times.
All I can say is that's the way it worked out. I knew from the time that I conceived of the book that the unspoken question in the novel was going to be, how do you measure the value of a life? And for Stern to be asking himself that, there has to be, or it was at least convenient, if there was a life that he was measuring himself against. And that was the life of his friend, Kirill Pafko. And obviously, if they are going to be friends, and after 40 years of acquaintance, Stern is learning a lot about this man, they would have to be rough contemporaries. So if I wanted to be somewhere near the present, Stern had to be 85, and Pafko was also going to be an elderly gent.
I thought it was kind of fun where you still had, you said, even though he was elderly, he still was not immune to the flirting of
right
down at Naples. Yeah.
Right.
Margaret Suchin Pickert wrote, absolutely loved your book testimony because I learned some history about the breakup of Yugoslavia and some of the struggles with different ethnic groups. How much research did you do to write the book?
To write testimony, I did a lot of research, and I went to Bosnia. Oddly, the testimony is set at the International Criminal Court, which basically tries crimes against humanity. And to pick up the rules of the court is not hard for any lawyer, because they're written down. The proceedings are broadcast over the internet, so I didn't have to go to The Hague to see the trials. I had to go to The Hague to absorb the milieu of the court, and I was glad I did it because it's a very, very formal place, and because the only protection that court has against the claims of playing politics with cases is rigid adherence to the rules. So it's a highly formalized atmosphere, which I wouldn't have known without going there. And Bosnia, it's just a beautiful country with great food, lovely people, and just a heartbreaking history. And the marks of that war, even 20 plus years later, are still on the country, and frankly, in many ways, unresolved. But there was a lot of research, including on the scene.
Here's another question about some research. Meryl Guzner from Chicago writes, after writing The Constant Gardener, John le Carre told Terry Gross in an interview on Fresh Air that it was difficult to start his next project because, and I'm paraphrasing here, his research into the drug industry has grabbed him and would not let him go. How did you learning more about what goes on in the drug industry how did it affect you?
Well, Le Carre has the advantage that he's not a lawyer. And so I would say that when I got away from drug law, I felt a great sense of relief. I will say that I learned a great deal from a sort of consumer and layperson's perspective. And this is going to strike people as maybe the most bizarre thing I say all night. I ended up feeling more sympathetic to large pharma than I had than I had expected. Now, that is not to say, however, that I'm hugely sympathetic. But when I recognize the magnitude of the investment that they have to make, it's just inevitable that they're going to want to make big profits because, we all, know about Claritin, but what we don't know is how many attempts to make other antihistamines failed, where they paid for hundreds of millions of dollars of research, all for naught.
Mitch Tobin writes, I remember loving 1L many years ago. Your fiction books are obviously wonderful, but I'm curious if you've ever been tempted to write more nonfiction as well. If not, why not? Or is that itch scratched by your writings and forums other than books?
Yeah, good point, Olivia. I did write a book that started out as an essay for the New Yorker about the death penalty. And that was because I had written a novel about the death penalty, and I felt like the novel was not really the right place to express my views, complicated though they are, about capital punishment. So I wrote this little book called Ultimate Punishment about capital punishment. But as you point out, it emanates from my occasional writing. And I do a lot of op-ed writing. I was lucky enough to have predicted the verdict in the O.J. Simpson case. And in those days, you had to, just the way type got set, I had to write the op-ed as if the acquittal had just come in, but I did it a day in advance. And for many years thereafter, because the op-ed had been so well received, I sort of had carte blanche to write, whatever I wanted for the Times, and I took advantage of it. And I've done a lot of op-ed writing. I write occasional pieces. I did a piece for the Washington Post recently about, my son sent me a text saying, Dad, your moment has finally come. It's time to write, an essay called "Bring Back the Handkerchief."
I read that. It was really cute.
Right, because I've always carried, a handkerchief in my back pocket, which is what I'm reaching for now. So, but that's really where most of my nonfiction writing is gone.
My friend Peg Duncan writes, who was your earliest mentor in writing, and what was the best advice you were given about being a writer?
Well, those are very direct questions, but harder to answer than you might think. Certainly, the great American fictionist Tilly Olson, who was my, tutor in college, played an enormous role in my life, because even though I wasn't her kind of writer, she, as she said in a salutation in one of her books that she gave me, she regarded me as a member of the true family of writers. And when you're doing something as daring, especially when you're a middle-class kid, saying I want to be an artist of some kind, it takes a lot of encouragement to forge that identity. So Tilly played a huge part. And then when I went and became a writing fellow at Stanford, people like Dick Scowcroft and Nancy Packer, who's the mother of George and Ann Packer, both two prominent writers in their own right now. But oddly, the advice that I probably remember most came from Wallace Stegner, who's really a giant of 20th century American fiction. And A.O. Scott just did a nice long article about Stegner in the New York Times that those of us who knew Wally were happy to see. But he was unafraid of saying that he was a professional writer. And that was in contradistinction to people who wanted to be bohemian artistes. And Wally said it was a job. It happened to be his job, but it was just like being a farmer. And if you don't put your butt in the chair every day and work on your novel, you're never going to finish the novel. And, that was simple advice, but whenever young people say to me, how do I become a writer? The answer is write. And if you don't write, you're not a writer. And if you do write, you are.
I like that. Mark Rosenberg writes to you, when you write a book about writing, do you prepare an outline first, or do you just dive right into the story you have in your head? And then how much do you stay with the outline as you write the book?
I don't outline. If I do have an outline, it's usually 1 page long, and it has maybe 15 lines on it. And that's just mostly so I can follow the overall arc of the story. And I just start writing. And, I knew Sandy Stern. I had a certain, I had a certain baseline. I went back and read The Burden of Proof. I read everything I had written about Stern. And that was an easy place to begin. But I didn't know Pinky. Stern, I knew, had practiced law with his daughter, Marta. But, what their relationship was like and what Marta Stern was like now in her late 50s, I didn't know. And I write my way along, either I write character histories or scenes. To me, very funny scene where Marta comes in and here's Stern, who's still dragging himself to the office at the age of 85. And Marta comes in early in the novel and tells her father that she's going to retire from the practice of law. And it really throws Stern for a loop. But that happened in that early exploratory phase where I'm just letting myself go, writing one scene, writing patches of dialogue, trying to figure out, what the attorney witness room is going to look like in the old federal courthouse. But there's no outlining. And after a year of that, the plot is pretty well developed in my head. And then I've got to put all of these disparate pieces together. And that's sometimes a challenge. And that's the only point where I will do any outlining. And as I say, it's just the 1 page, just so I can remember, which significant events are going to follow each other.
Well, I guess when you started, did you know who the bad guys were going to be at the beginning? And then fill it in, or are you
In the
saying
last trial? No.
Yeah.
No.
Oh.
I didn't know if Kirill Pafko was innocent or guilty.
Maybe that's why it shows. Like, because I'm reading it, I can't tell. Is he a good guy? Is he a bad guy? Do I like him? Do I not? So maybe you're figuring that out too as you're writing it, and that keeps us on edge.
I was.
Like it. See, I know nothing about this process. I like reading, but someone else writes about, this is Thomas McFeely again. Do you find practicing law, taking a break from your writing work, help with your writing? The ability to step away, does that make your writing crisper, less tired?
Well, in the days when I was really practicing a lot more than I do now, I was very mindful of, somebody asked Saul Bellow why he taught, why he was a teacher. And he says, well, every writer needs something to do in the afternoon. I continued to practice law for lots of different reasons, starting with the fact that I think, although it runs against the common conception, I think lawyers can do a lot of good for their clients. And to have that direct connection to somebody who really needed my help every day, and versus this world that existed only in my head, it was a very nice contrast. I never stole details from cases, because you just don't, you don't want to, you don't want to violate your client's trust and privacy that way. But the milieu of what I was absorbing by practicing law obviously has been, you know, has made its way into every single one of these novels.
I think this question's really funny. This is from Jerry Swaney. Is there a particular character you have created that in retrospect you despise?
Well, I guess does he mean like a major character? You know, there are bad guys in life, people who do bad things. You know, I'm not sure Kirill Pafko comes off too well by the end of the last trial. Certainly he's never managed to engage a lot of my sympathies. But, you know, I really do believe what every criminal defense lawyer learns, which is everybody's got their own story. Even if it's not a story anybody else can relate to, the famous, line is the guy is standing over the body of his wife saying, you know, she made me do it. And that's his story. And he believes that in the moment that he's saying it.
So there are a bunch of COVID-related questions as well. This one is from Rena Van Tyne. She asks, are you considering writing about court proceedings during COVID? And I'm guessing she means like the Zoom proceedings. As my husband's always on all these court calls that, you know, dressed from the head to waist.
Right. I actually read one of the emails in the firm today that one of the local judges in Chicago said, no virtual background when you appear in front of me, because I don't know who else is in the room and whether there are people who shouldn't be part, for example, of a settlement conference or something like that, which I thought was a very understandable thing for a judge to say. We're all finding our way. Somebody I've met during the course of this virtual book tour sent me an article from Traverse City where they had their first live criminal trial started this week, but they had to hold it in the local high school, which of course is not being used, because that was the only way they could keep the jurors, the witnesses, and the court personnel socially distanced. So, there will be great art that will come from this time, and undoubtedly great narrative too. But I'm not, right now, like most of us, my first interest is surviving. But it has been, I think, for me, like everybody else, a very disorienting, strange time. And I look up and I say, why haven't you written more? And the answer is, I just feel constantly distracted.
Yeah, I get it. One of my friends, Peter Bauer, writes, propelled by the characters in the last trial and your wife's law background, will your next book include estate planning issues?
Adrian will probably take umbrage in this. And of course, one can point out that Bleak House, which is one of the great novels about the law ever written, really involves estate planning issues. But I guess I'll say I don't know enough about it. Although, as I sit here and think about it, family strife, there probably are good books to be written about estate planning issues. So.
Oh, if Adrian's listening, he's saying that it's boring and he's not going to write about it. So we have an anonymous attendee who writes, was your approach to writing this book different from how you've approached your other books? It feels slightly different than your other books, but I don't know how to put my finger on why.
I don't, the approach was no different. The novel felt like it was going well from very early on. And if it weren't for my publisher's delays, all my novels have appeared in these 3-year intervals. This one actually could have appeared after 2 years, but it didn't fit with Grand Central's plans. I would come out of the study, Adrian's reminded me, and I would say, sometimes it feels like this book is just writing itself. So I don't know what is different except for, the quietly elegiac tone of writing about an 85-year-old person who is giving up what has been one of the most meaningful activities in his life. But I can't say that there was anything different from the books that went before. It felt like it was pretty successful to me as a writer, but I'll let others make that judgment.
When will we know if it's going to be a New York Times bestseller? Like, when do the numbers come in?
Oh, this is the last trial was released May 12th and was immediately on the New York Times bestseller list. So it opened at number 7 and stayed on for 3 or 4 weeks. It's still been on the USA Today list. So yeah, it's officially a bestseller, Olivia.
That's so awesome. I mean, so I have another question. So I did buy that one in a hard copy, and actually, you signed this one, by the way, just so you know. But I got a signed copy, and then I got one out in hard copy. But then I got impatient, and I bought Personal Injury as an ebook on my iPhone, and because I didn't want to wait for it to be shipped. Can you explain to us, kind of the difference between buying a hard copy book and an ebook, and how does that affect the writer?
Well, I am the former president of the Authors Guild, so I will give you an Authors Guild perspective on this. First of all, as far as I am concerned, the words are the same, and the reading experience, just like listening to a book, is, I still think, fundamentally the same. There are economic differences because the royalty on an ebook is lower than the royalty on a hardcover book. And the way it works out is that the hardcover book, there's basically a 50-50 split of the net proceeds between author and publisher. And on the ebook, it's 25%. So, and frankly, for people lucky enough to be able to refer to themselves as a best-selling author, it doesn't make any difference. But that lower percentage has a big impact on people who are a little lower down on the food chain. I think it's a grievous wrong, and there is no reason. Publishers have a much better deal on ebooks. They have no risk that the book is going to be returned, which is what happens on physical books. They don't have to pay printing costs. They don't have to warehouse it. They don't have to ship it. So the ebook is basically all profit for the publisher, and not to share more generously with the author is disappointing. And the authors' organizations, and certainly the Guild, which is the biggest of them, has a hard time fighting about this too much, because we also recognize that our publishers are up against the wall between Amazon and Google and Apple, all of these people who are basically trying to steal their lunch. So, but do I think that the ebook royalty deserves to be raised? Absolutely. And do I think it's wrong? Yes, I do.
Well, I'm not going to buy them as an ebook anymore. I'll just be more patient and ship it. Plus, I was buying ebooks because I was commuting on the Blue Line, and it's much easier to flip through on your phone and read than to carry a big book around and like squeeze against other people and shove them because you're kind of the jerk with the big book on the train. But thanks for sharing that with us. I think that a lot of us as consumers don't understand the difference.
I don't know how to break this to you, Olivia, but you're going to reach a point in your life where reading on your phone will be a far more daunting task than it is right now. So your eyes will not permit it. So
I saw the eye doctor yesterday, and he told me it's going to happen pretty soon. So
yeah. So well, talk to me in 10 years.
Thank you so much for being here. I want to read one last comment who's from the founder of our beautiful museum, the American Writers Museum. For those of you who haven't been there, once this all is over, please come to Chicago. Please check out our amazing gem of a museum. So Malcolm O'Hagan, who lives in DC, wrote, "Thanks, Scott, for doing this a totally engaging interview and for your support of the AWM. If I wanted to be a successful litigator or investigator, all I would need to do is read all your books. There should be a Turow degree."
Well, Malcolm O'Hagan, for the few people who haven't met him, is one of the most charming human beings on the face of the earth. And when he first talked to me about this museum many years ago, I was doing a book event in DC. I thought he was, he had the vapors, that this was impossible. And this museum is a living testament to Malcolm and what one person with a great idea and indomitable will can accomplish.
And charm.
And charm.
Got all of us to get in there and work on it. So thank you so much again, Scott. I can't wait to read about Pinky and all of her adventures. And thank you all so much for listening in. I'm sorry I didn't get to all of the questions, but they were wonderful.
Thank you. Thanks for doing this, Olivia. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you and good night.